Hello, everybody, and welcome to the deep dive seminar on the lead article published in Frontiers in Science, entitled Conservation Imperatives Securing the Last Unprotected Terrestrial Sites Harboring Irreplaceable Biodiversity. I am Laure Sonnier. I am the executive editor of Frontiers in Science, and I am really excited about today's event. As we all know, our planet is experiencing the sixth mass extinction caused by human activities that are damaging habitats and changing the climate. So it's really vital that we all work together to protect all critical habitats for biodiversity. So the article we will be discussing today is a result of a collaboration between a large panel of worldwide experts, some of whom are with us today. And I'd like to extend a special thank you to Dr. Eric Dinerstein from Resolve and to Professor Carlos Perez from the University of East Anglia for your trust and for your leadership in bringing this really important project to success, and also for working with us to publish it in Frontiers in Science. So just a few words about Frontiers in Science. So we did launch Frontiers in Science just over 18 months ago, and it's our open access, multidisciplinary flagship journal at Frontiers. Our editorial scope is guided by the United Nations Sustainable Development Agenda and focuses on transformational science to accelerate solutions for human and planetary health. So how do we build the journal? It's all commission content, so we commission exceptional peer-reviewed lead articles from internationally renowned researchers whose work obviously addresses global challenges in human and in planetary health. Then around each of these articles, we built a hub of multi-audience content, including scientific viewpoints, editorials, policy articles, and also content for children and the general public. And all that is done and designed to really extend the journal reach and the journal impact across all of society, across science, policy, and society audiences. I'm very proud to say that no other publisher is doing this the way we do. And indeed, we are very proud to be driving innovation in publishing today so that the critical transformational science that we need to tackle all the global challenges we are facing today can really reach everyone in society and really help drive and accelerate scientific progress for all. So it's going to be a great event and an amazing discussion, I'm sure. And today's discussion is going to be moderated by my colleague Gilbert de Gregorio, who is the Associate Director of the Frontiers Planet Prize, another initiative at Frontiers, which is a global competition awarding prizes of $1 million to scientists whose research contribute to helping humanity stay within the safe operating space of our Earth system. So with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Gil, and I will wish to everyone to enjoy the event as much as I will. Thank you very much, and welcome, everyone.
Thank you very much, Laure. A warm welcome to everyone around the world today. We have representation from over 82 countries, so thank you very much for joining. I'm delighted to be your moderator for this very exciting deep dive today, based on the article that Laure has introduced. So the lead article, it's called Conservation Imperatives Securing the Last Unprotected Terrestrial Sites Harboring Irreplaceable Biodiversity. Recently published, so in June 2024, by the lead article with us today, Dr. Eric Dinerstein of Resolve and Professor Carlos Perez from the University of East Anglia. And based on the introduction about the prize, I'm also pleased to share that Professor Carlos Perez was an inaugural international champion of the prize, where he was awarded 1 million Swiss francs to invest in his research and his nonprofit in the Instituto Jurois, really looking at promoting conservation. So, with the sixth mass extinction underway, and right off the bat of COP16 in Cali, protecting critical habitats for rare and endangered species has never been more urgent. This deep dive aims to answer this precise question: how can we prioritize and secure the last hotspots for irreplaceable biodiversity? Conservation imperatives are areas of lands containing rare and threatened species or species with a narrow range and are not within national parks, community reserves, or other types of protected areas. And it was a term that was introduced by Dinerstein and his co-authors. And in this paper, they've identified almost 17,000 such sites around the world, which cover 164 million hectares, which represent only 1.22% of the Earth's terrestrial surface. The lead article and the complementary publications in this article hub outline strategic actions to urgently safeguard these crucial sites by 2030, and also ensure protected area networks are effective, equitable, and inclusive. So the urgency of this action and the topical nature of this work has been amplified and already been picked up by very many top-tier news outlets, including The Guardian, Le Monde, Reuters, Newsweek, and Mongabay. So, with today's session, I really look forward to starting this deep dive and exploring the next steps of habitat conservation of rare and threatened species as part of a larger global biodiversity strategy, so that we can counteract this ongoing sixth mass extinction driven by human activities. So this is the article hub. It includes an editorial by Mariana Napolitano Ferreira of WWF Brazil. There is a viewpoint article by Professor David Lindenmayer from the Australian National University, and a policy outlook by Dr. Charles Victor Barber, who is a Director for Natural Resource Governance and Policy at the World Resources Institute based in the USA. We have an explainer, which provides a lay summary of the article with nice infographics and a video. And we also have an article that's been translated for more intergenerational knowledge in our Journal for Kids, Frontiers for Young Minds. So to start off today's agenda, we will kick off with our lead author, with Dr. Eric Dinerstein. He will be introducing us to the conservation imperatives. Will then be followed by his co-author, Andy Lee from Resolve, who will dive a bit deeper into the article. And then we'll have Dr. Aldrin Mallari of Conservation Innovations, who will be addressing some of the cautionary concerns as we navigate through the conservation imperatives journey. And then we will end up with a panel discussion, a Q&A session with all three speakers, and our final guest panelist today, who's Dr. Stephen Woodley of the IUCN. Let's get started. We'll turn to our first speaker and the lead author of the article, Dr. Eric Dinerstein, who is an internationally recognized conservationist and joins us today as a lead author of the article. He's also a senior biodiversity expert at Resolve. Few words about Resolve. It's a highly respected international NGO that helps forge sustainable solutions to critical social, health, and environmental challenges by creating innovative partnerships where they're least likely to be made but are most needed. He spent 25 years as chief scientist at the WWF, where he had a significant impact on global conservation policy. And throughout his professional life, Eric has a track record of creating conservation plans for iconic places such as the Galapagos Islands, the Himalayas, the Panda Mountains of China, and naturally has published extensively on all of these areas, including large mammal conservation, being an active contributor to the scientific research and conservation policy development domains. I hope I gave your introduction good justice, Eric. So once again, thank you very much for bringing this article to Frontiers in Science, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gil, and it's really a pleasure to be here. Typically, scientific papers put acknowledgements at the end, but I'm going to put acknowledgements right up front. And first, to thank Frontiers, which I'll get back to in a moment, but to all of my co-authors who worked so hard on this paper, and to all of you who are listening today, because by your presence here, it really shows that the global commitment of so many dedicated conservationists and scientists to saving life on Earth. I do want to say a word about Frontiers in Science, though, is what an absolute pleasure it's been to work with them, the staff, to bring this paper to publication. There are a lot of people, scientists who are probably on this webinar who have experienced publication efforts, and it seems more like almost like a form of torture that it was invented in the Spanish Inquisition. The experience with Frontiers in Science has been just the opposite, that it totally renews your faith in publishing a paper and getting a fair review, fair hearing, wonderful graphics development, wonderful support in all sorts of ways, as you've seen in the preamble here. I wish that there were more journals like Frontiers in Science that would put this much effort to get behind the science that's being put out there for the good of the world and conservation. So with that, I'm going to go forward with our talk. And it's obviously been a grim few weeks for those of us who are involved in international conservation, starting with the rather meager results from the COP in Colombia, where there wasn't much progress towards the goal of protecting 30% by 2030. The recent election in the US, where we could ignore 50 years of climate science in formulating policy, and the recent welcoming remarks from the president of Azerbaijan saying that oil is a gift from God and we should be pumping as much out of the ground as we could when we know we have to move to energy transition away from fossil fuels. But what I'm going to present today is really something that should give us all hope about how achievable it can be to head off the 6th mass extinction event that we currently find ourselves in. And that's the basis for conservation imperatives. So we'll take that from there and try to give all of you a sense of how united we can do something that really saves life on Earth for future generations. So my emblem species for today is going to be the rose-headed, the pink-headed fruit dove from a couple of sites in Indonesia, a few in Sumatra, a few on the island of Java and Bali. That's very, very limited range, which is kind of a flagship concept for our paper. And really, the whole idea is to identify those species on Earth that are closest to extinction, where timely interventions could prevent that from happening. I'm sure there are a lot of sharp-eyed birders out there, and if I'm going to put you to the test to see how many of these pink or magenta polygons you could find on this map of different hemispheres of the Earth. And if you're really good, you might be able to find a couple of hundred, but in fact, there are 16,825 sites out here that are listed as conservation imperatives that are polygons, habitats where species that are narrow range endemics that occur nowhere else on Earth, or that are also listed as critically endangered or endangered by the IUCN, and the only places to conserve them. There's a couple of important points here. The fact that these are really so hard to see at this scale tells us that they are very small. And that's one of the most hopeful aspects of all of this, that while we need to conserve 30%, and some of us would argue even 50% of the terrestrial and marine realms to truly save life on Earth, that to head off the extinction crisis, there's only about 1.2 and actually now 1.1% of the Earth's terrestrial surface that is currently unprotected, that if we were to protect it in the near future, we could stave off the worst of the extinction crisis. So the headlines for our paper that I'll present right up front is that we offer a solution to staving the extinction crisis that is affordable, doable, and strategic. And the rest of the program today will go through that and explain why this is possible. So let's start first with how we assembled the conservation imperatives. And we start where any global conservation analysis would start, which is with the world database on protected areas. And we used data from 2023. So you can see at the very bottom here, protected area 1 and PA2. So that's the base map. We want to look at what's already protected, at least on paper, and then add to that the distributions of rare species using widely used, and in this way we're being very ecumenical, widely used published accounts in peer-reviewed journals of distributions of rare plants and animals, from the Alliance for Zero Extinction that looks at species that are found on only one site, 40% of which are unprotected, range rarity species for tropical forests, the IUCN Red List of threatened species, key biodiversity areas, small range vertebrate species, and rare plant species, endemic plants. So by combining these layers and looking at what is currently protected and what is not, we get the first analysis that we can do to start to refine the conservation imperatives. What we then do is we apply a fractional land cover analysis based on the latest Copernicus satellite data that removes what we call area of non-habitat from those polygons that we showed earlier. The reason we do that is that in a lot of places, areas have been converted, and it's only through more recent data that we're able to see more clearly from the Copernicus data more recently what's been removed. And so we don't want to count that as well, because that will be overcounting. So once we intersect that fractional land cover analysis, we go from when a paper we published in 2020 called the Global Safety Net, where identified 1.2% of the Earth's surface that contained these unprotected rare species, it dropped 2.3%, dropped to 1.2%, so a halving of the total area. We also then looked at a critical question, which is, after removing the non-habitat, we're left with these conservation imperatives, is how many of these polygons are adjacent to existing protected areas? Because it would be much cheaper to just extend the management effect from one reserve to these unprotected areas. And the interesting finding is that there are 38% of all the 16,825 areas we identified as conservation imperatives lie within 2.5 kilometers of existing protected areas. So let's go into more details of the analysis. There's been many calls for protecting 30% by 2030, which is now brought into the global biodiversity framework, which we'll hear about from Steve Woodley. Many of us advocate for half Earth, or protecting half by at least 2050, if not before, to truly protect life on Earth. But having said that, even if the results of the Cali COP were not as encouraging as possible to get to 2030, there weren't major commitments. Even if we were able just to focus on this 1.2%, we would have a dramatic impact in the next few years. If we zoom in even further, we can identify that within the tropical belt alone, where most of the conservation imperative sites is only 0.76% of the tropics that need increasing protection. This reinforces the idea that this is doable and will get to affordable, but also very strategic. Now, so how well are we doing in protecting these global rarities? That was a question that we posed, and the database that we used to answer this question was we compared the amount of area that was set aside from the World Database in Protected Areas in 2018, and compared that to up to April 2023, when we put together the data for the paper. And you would expect that with all of the effort, all of the attention placed on species extinctions and the concern of saving life on Earth, that perhaps maybe half or more of the unprotected sites in that 5-year interval would have been protected. In fact, it was the reverse, that only 7% of the sites that we identified with range-limited and threatened species were actually protected over this 5-year interval. In fact, most of the increase in protected areas came from some big reserves added in the Amazon and in the Sahara. So clearly, rare and endangered species are underrepresented in the selection of new protected areas, and that's what we have to reverse right away. here, this just illustrates it, and we can do a sort of a visual exercise here. How many of you, however sharp-eyed people there are, can identify small green polygons on this map here? They're very, very hard to see. So these are the areas that actually over the last 5 years were set aside for protection of rarities. And so you can see that we haven't visually made much progress, but we can greatly improve our performance in this area. And if we do so, even if we don't get to 30% by 2030, if we just got another 2 or 3% that covered these areas, we have enough time to do the other things we have to do, but we've averted the extinction crisis in a large part. Now, to show how this can be more strategic, years ago, we published an ecoregion map of the world of 846 ecoregions, and there were about 40 ecoregions among the different biogeographic realms where if we focused our attention, particularly in places like Brazil, the Philippines, of which we'll hear a great deal more about in this session, we can do a dramatic amount of good for conservation in relatively small areas. Let's zoom in on a couple of countries really quickly, and just to show how this can be done is we know now where the species are that are most threatened, that are unprotected. We can name them. We can name the places. We have that in the data. For example, in Colombia, if we go to the northern part in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, a massif that arose before the Andes, we have the blue-billed curassow, a beautiful bird that's almost extinct across its former range in the Andes that only exists in a few places. So we have that granularity of mapping where these species are and to move conservation forward in these areas. Similarly, in Indonesia, where we just completed a more detailed analysis, we see, interestingly, and Indonesia ranks third in the number of conservation imperative sites in the world, with over 1,500 sites, is that while we may only have about 53 sites in the island of Sumatra, we have 80% of the sites in the island of Sulawesi and 50% of the land area of all the conservation imperatives. So clearly, targeting Sulawesi conservation efforts in Indonesia would have the biggest dividends. And we'll hear more about that too. Interestingly, the distribution of conservation imperative sites is not random. It's not evenly distributed. It's highly concentrated. In fact, if we could focus on just 10 countries across the world for our efforts to prevent extinctions, it would cover 72% of all sites. If we were to do this for the top 30 countries, it would be 82%. So by being strategic in our investments, we can really have a dramatic impact. And here we show just the distribution. You can see between the Philippines, Brazil, and Indonesia, almost half of all sites occur in these 3 countries. Now let's break it down even further, and we'll look at the top 10 countries with the most number of sites, and we can see that here. And hopefully there are many people on the call today who are from these sites who are actively working to conserve rare species in those areas. But we can also see the distribution here is that by far a large number of sites are in the neotropics, and particularly another important point is that if we segregate or disaggregate this into size classes of the sites, we can see that 99% of the conservation imperative sites are more than 1,000 hectares. This is important too, because if we conserve these sites, we have a much better chance, the largest sites, of maintaining viable populations of these species into the future. And as I've said earlier, that 38% of them are connected to other existing reserves. That helps us as well. I didn't mention in the point about Colombia that of the many sites in Colombia, which ranks 5th in the world in terms of conservation imperative sites, is that 56% of all sites are adjacent to protected areas. So that gives us a real head start in trying to conserve these additional places. So the next big question is, how much would it cost to implement conservation imperatives? This is an important part of the analysis because it shows that not only is this doable and strategic, but it's affordable. So I won't go into the details of the Monte Carlo simulations, how we collected the data, but essentially to say that this is the first global effort to use actual data from almost 1,000 sites that were purchased over the last 10 years in areas where we have conservation imperatives polygons to identify costs of land purchase. And there's some really important findings here. First of all, it's much cheaper to purchase land in the neotropics than it is in almost anywhere else in the region, whereas in the Indo-Malayan realm, it's more expensive per square kilometer. Part of that is it's easier to buy land in the neotropics than in countries in the Indo-Malayan realm. In the Indo-Malayan realm, there's a lot of areas that have been converted to very valuable oil palm plantations, and so the land is more expensive. But building this all into our model of differentiating between biogeographic realms and how much the basic cost is, we're able to come up with some global cost numbers that I think are really astonishing. We can look at this globally and say, to safeguard all conservation imperative sites, it would cost about $263 billion for land purchase. If we segregate that to just the tropical belt, where most of these sites occur, it's only $169 billion. And that comes out to just about, for the world, between $34 and $56 billion a year over the next 3 to 5 years. Now, you can use whatever analogy you'd like to say, well, what does that compare to? In the United States, we spend somewhere around $35 billion a year on pet food and pet grooming. For the same amount of money, we can safeguard extinctions. Now, this is not to say that just doing the conservation imperatives would head off the extinction crisis. For example, we recognize that some of the most threatened biota are on the 1,300 tropical archipelagos in the world where we have invasive species, where it's not a question of adding more land, it's a question of protecting the fragile biotas, the flora and fauna, from invasive species. And that's a critical part of it. But some of this could go, these funding could go to that too. It's also clear that in some countries, simply purchasing land either is not possible or not the best way to go about it. And community reserves is a critical part of this. Also, 17% of all the conservation imperative sites overlap with indigenous lands. So the most important thing we can do for conservation globally is to empower and finance indigenous communities and local people wherever they want and agree with this to protect conservation and protect conservation imperatives. So there are many ways to get this to this route, which will likely reduce the price, that the tag that we've put on here. So I'd like to end with a few thoughts. One is from one of the great conservation biologists and ecologists in the world, Dr. Richard Cowling, who's the world's expert on the fynbos and the ecoregion called the Albany Thicket in South Africa. And he coined the aphorism that conservation is 10% science and 90% negotiation. The science is the easy part. The difficult part is moving from what we need to do, what scientists tell us, to actually make it happen. And that's what a lot of the rest of this program is going to do, because I can speak for my co-authors that we didn't write this paper just to write another paper on biodiversity, but to lead to conservation, to lead to action on the ground that actually leaves a vibrant planet for future generations. And I suppose beyond just this, to add one more, is if the late Tom Lovejoy were still alive, he would likely be a co-author on this paper. And Ed Wilson, who's many consider the father of biodiversity, would have surely been one of the strongest backers of the conservation imperatives idea, and to move as fast as we can to head off extinctions. So because of them, I modify this as 10% science, 80% negotiation, and 10% inspiration. One of the most profound aphorisms that I've ever come across is from my colleague, Dr. David MacDonald, the head of Wild Crew at Oxford. And he was once talking to his fellow graduate students when he was back at the University of Edinburgh, and they were trying to come up with interesting research topics for their dissertations or just to talk about. And David came up with the important insight that it's easy to be interesting, it's much harder to be useful. And that really guides the work that we've done under conservation imperatives, and everything we do going forward is that we have to put this science to good use. So now I'll hand it over to my colleagues to take us to the next steps.
Thank you very much, Eric. That was a very impactful and important overview of the key messages in your lead article and on the cost-effective strategy to implement the conservation imperatives. So yes, just want to have the opportunity to introduce Andy here, who will be speaking. He's also one of the authors from Resolve, and he's the driving force in conservation technology on a mission to address the most pressing threats to wildlife through the creative application of science, technology, and collaborative processes. A few notes about Andy: he's a project coordinator and a research scientist for biodiversity at Resolve. And he spearheads initiatives to enhance environmental sustainability and monitor ecosystems. His current research centers on global biodiversity conservation, including the global safety net and conservation imperatives, which we've already learnt about, whilst also facilitating grant making to expand protection into endangered habitats. Very wholesome work. So Andy, very warm welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Gilbert, and thanks, Eric, for the presentation and a deep dive into the conservation imperatives research. And I think we've all learned from Eric about the urgency and opportunities to protect conservation imperatives and how to safeguard biodiversity. And I think a lot of us in our mind has a critical question next is where do we actually start and how do we actually translate this global analysis into action on the ground? And what does it take to implement these strategies effectively and sustainably? And as a co-author of the paper, I've been actually fortunate to be coordinating efforts at the country level and to work with biodiversity experts and local NGOs to identify and verify high priority conservation imperative sites for protection. And we understand that this actually requires a very different approach from a global biodiversity analysis where we look at data sets and maps. And just as the diversity of endangered species and habitats highlighted by the conservation imperatives vary globally, we understand that conservation mechanisms but must also adapt to the local context. Effective implementation needs to be led by local experts who have an understanding of each site's and region's specific dynamics, whether it is ecological, socio-economical, or even political. So we work closely with experts to select priority sites based on threats levels, feasibility, local support, and aiming for rapid protections of these conservation imperative sites in the region where funding is available. Protecting conservation imperative sites will also take different forms in different regions. We use a range of strategies that we want to approach, such as simply protected area designation, land purchase and acquisition, conservation easement, and even creating community reserves, etc., that we adopt to the specific needs of each site. This approach leverages existing conservation initiatives and align them with conservation imperatives goals to help us maximize the impact. The adaptability of conservation imperatives is a key strength. It actually allows us to build on what's already working locally and the efforts that have been led by local teams. And our near-term goal is to help identify top priority sites in each country and develop proposals and pathway such that we can attract fundings, philanthropic supports, and investment and to secure immediate protections for these areas. And we think that these will be actually the first of the top sites to be protected and creating a catalytic mechanisms that will help us drive further efforts into other sites and across the whole globally conservation imperatives. And as Eric mentioned earlier in his presentation, many tropical countries host the majority of the conservation imperative sites. These include Indonesia, Brazil, the Philippines, and Peru, being the top in terms of both area covered and the number of sites. And together, these countries account for more than 17% of the global area and 57% of identified sites. And this is one of the main reasons why we have chose to begin site assessments and proposal developments in these countries. By prioritizing efforts in these regions, we can maximize our impact on global conservation and accelerate the protection of these sites. So in the next couple of slides, I'll briefly review our assessment work in Brazil mainly and also in Indonesia, and will be followed by a deeper dive into the Philippines by Dr. Mallari. Yeah, as we see, Brazil, as we all know, is one of the world's most biodiverse countries, and it's home to 10% of almost all global species. And however, a lot of its rich habitats actually face severe threats from deforestation, agriculture, and development. And we can see actually a lot of the conservation imperative sites that we identify focuses not in the Amazon, where there's relatively more protected area, but in the coastal area where development and human pressures is higher. Our site assessment work, led by our co-author, Professor Carlos Perez, identified 10 critical areas for conservation across 5 major Brazilian biomes. And this include the Amazon rainforest, Atlantic forest, Caatinga dry forest, Pantanal wetlands, and the Pampas grassland. These areas represent Brazil's most diverse ecosystem, and each has a strong potential for conservation impact. Many of the 3,300 conservation imperative sites in Brazil are concentrated across and along the coastal region. And this actually emphasized the urgent needs to protect these high-risk area. Carlos' team worked closely with local experts and communities to identify sites where immediate actions can be taken. In some cases, they even actually found areas upon working with the local teams outside the initial conservation imperative sites that require urgent protections. And in some ways, this highlights the importance of combining our global analysis with ground truthing with local expertise and addressing conservation needs and effectively to identify gaps and maximize our potential for protecting these areas. One of the highlighted from Carlos' assessments is actually a underutilized strategy in Brazil, which is land purchase for conservation. And while this approach has been effective in many other regions, it seems to be less common in Brazil due to rising land value. Increased investment is urgently needed to secure these sites before further developments drive the prices up and make conservation more challenging. Another country we are coordinating site assessment work is in Indonesia. Indonesia contains the largest area of conservation imperative sites within the tropics and supports over 350 endangered species, making it a global priority for conservation. Yet these areas are severely under threat from deforestation, illegal logging, and also rapid expansion of oil palm plantation. And in fact, in one of our follow-up analysis we're conducting, we're seeing a further reduction of the conservation imperative area from globally 1.2% to 1.1%, after we have incorporated further refined fractional land cover data, revealing further habitat loss due to oil palm plantation. Our assessment work in Indonesia, as Eric mentioned earlier, has focused on primarily identifying key opportunities for protection in Sulawesi, which we can see as one of the most intact conservation contiguous conservation imperative sites opportunities for protection. And Sulawesi is home to some of the most intact and biologically significant habitats in Indonesia, hosting many ecoregions. But interestingly, unlike Brazil, where land purchase are more feasible and the cost is usually lower, conservation in Indonesia relies more heavily on local partnerships and locally led initiatives. And here in our assessment work, we identify many opportunities to work with local NGOs, community reserves, and indigenous communities, as well as local government, to collaborate and establish protective measures. This is not only supported, this ensure that these actions in the long term is not only supported locally, but also sustainable and resilient to future risk and land plan changes. And we are focusing on our effort in this assessments to expand protected area and strengthen community-based management. And forming partnerships with local NGOs who have the expertise and in implementing conservation imperatives is crucial for maintaining long-term conservation efforts and ensuring that these strategies are sustainable. And so to conclude, protecting conservation imperative sites requires both a global analysis that provides solid scientific evidence and also expensive and immense collaborative approach in the local level and leveraging local expertise and global support to ensure that these protections are adaptable but also long-term sustainable. So now I'll turn next to Dr. Mallari, who will also share more about his work and the ongoing assessment in the Philippines on conservation imperative sites. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Andy. That was a very engaging overview. And before I introduce Aldrin Mallari to our audience, a brief reminder, if you have any questions about what's being presented, do add them to our Q&A chat. We're going to put them together so we can then share these with the panelists in an ongoing discussion towards the end. So let's move on. Our final speaker for today is Dr. Neil Aldrin Mallari, who is a president and chief scientist of the Center for Conservation Innovations in the Philippines. Aldrin is a seasoned conservationist. He's led program development and directed various projects across the Philippines designed to implement and promote biodiversity and conservation. And he's looking to improve protected areas management, habitat restoration, and the strategic planning. He is the co-founder of a number of biodiversity conservation NGOs across the Philippines, including the Center of Conservation Innovations. He's also a regional focal point for the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, a National Geographic Explorer, and an Ashoka Fellow with a very prominent activities within conservation and advocate. A very prolific researcher. He's published over 40 scientific publications, including award-winning and seminal conservation books, and is an ecology professor at De La Salle University and the Far Eastern University in the Philippines. So with that, Aldrin, thank you very much. A warm welcome to you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gil. Good evening or good morning, wherever you are. Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps to begin this exercise or this conversation, you know, we in the mid-90s until early 2000, we have mapped threatened birds and other biodiversity and important areas where these biodiversity are. In 2015, 15 years after the publication of that directory, we raised a cautionary note for conservationists and the government, saying that we are not hitting the IG target 11 on protected areas. Although the coverage of the protected areas then was about 15% of the total land area of the Philippines, much of these protected areas are either too small or do not overlap the KBAs that were already identified. And therefore, the new 30 by 30 target presents a bigger challenge for us indeed. I was very fortunate to have met Eric and introduced the idea of conservation imperatives early this year. We have worked with him and Andy and their team since then to turn the paper into actionable activities to address the gap. To this, and the next slides that I'll be showing would be a whistle-stop tour of the 10 incipient sites that we've identified and selected to increase the scope of the coverage of the Philippines' protected and conserved areas. We have made great efforts to ensure that these proposed conservation imperatives will also increase the representativeness of the biogeographic regions in the country. The Philippines is such an important country, although it's, you know, compared to Brazil, Philippines is, well, Brazil is 27 times bigger than the Philippines, but the endemism in the Philippines is amazing. 66% of our terrestrial vertebrates are endemic. And so, you know, that underscores the importance of this country in this region. Some of the proposed areas, as you can see in this map, may seem very tiny, but here we want to highlight the astounding rate of endemism and narrow endemism in the Philippines. The conservation requirements of, say, endemic frogs or karst frogs in this proposed sites defy classical large landscape level conservation strategies. Part of the consideration in our site selection is the possibility of increasing the scope and effectiveness of existing protected areas by either extending the original boundaries of the PA or creating a network of OECMs around the perimeter of the protected areas you can see in this map. And especially because the Philippines is it's a fringing archipelago, especially small island ecosystems always fall through the cracks in the prioritization process. And now, allow me to share with you some my insights on the challenges moving forward. The first would be talking about size. As new science had become more available to us, our understanding using niche overlaps have given us a fresh perspective. If you look at this map, there seems to be a packing of critical areas of habitat in the eastern side of this island. This is the southernmost island of the Philippines. Our reflection is that in our analysis, if we fail in protecting this biodiversity corridor, as you can see there, we might be pushing more of the species in this region further to the edge. And sometimes I always say, forget about biodiversity conservation in the Philippines, because if we fail in this region, there will be a more wholesale extinction within this biogeographic region. The concept of KBAs have had great traction in the Philippines. Funding agencies, development partners, and NGOs have taken the KBAs as priorities. That was good news to us. However, the downside is that this has resulted to cherry picking of sites and creating this site partitioning mechanism or silos of sites. Reflecting back on the previous slide that typifies a niche congruence model, it is telling us that if we're aiming for long-term survival of threatened endemic species, we need to cover as much ground as possible. The entire survival envelopes, for example, of the assemblage of vulnerable species need to be put in our consideration. And therefore, single sites on their own simply won't cut it. Meanwhile, if you zoom out and look at the national level, over the last couple of decades or so, we have seen massive contraction of these suitable habitats for about 50 threatened endemic species in the Philippines. And this is quite alarming for us. Having this conservation imperatives notion or paradigm has given us hope as well. The other sort of caveat, the second caveat, is about capacity to deliver. We have hope that the protected areas will deliver the conservation outcomes. In these exemplar PAs, these are fully funded. There are conservation infrastructures that have been set up to deliver the goals of the PAs. But clearly, as you can see in these maps, it seems that the degradation and deforestation is even higher inside the boundaries of the protected areas. If you look at the changes over time of suitable habitats vis-a-vis the management effectiveness tracking tool scores of these protected areas, there seems to be an inverse relationship between MET scores and the area of suitable habitats over time. There's also a downhill trend. If you look at this map in another protected area, and you will see that the current boundaries of the PA, or the protected area, is not sufficiently covering the important areas that need protection. As you can see, those areas of habitat on the left side, on the right side of the protected area. So if we have protected areas like this, being fully funded, legislated by government, so what are we protecting or conserving in these protected areas then? If over time, you're increasing MET scores and yet you're losing those suitable habitats in very alarming rate. It begs a question, of course, that perhaps there is no adequacy in the capacity to conserve biodiversity and really to deliver the twin agenda or objectives of protected areas. When we deal with a 30-30 target, I hope that we go beyond the numbers game. And also perhaps a sort of another part, point for reflection. How do we measure success, and what are those metrics? Are these encapsulated just by the MET scores or captured by the MET scores? How about measuring the condition and extent of ecosystems as a result of the management interventions or the lack thereof? Here you can see MET scores soaring from 50% to 90%, and yet you have gross deforestation degradation within this protected area. The third caveat is about granularity. One of the key challenges in doing prioritization is the scale that we use and the data that we use in our analysis. When we did our analysis of the important biodiversity areas, or KBAs, a quarter of a century ago, we only used point localities and low resolution maps. And perhaps this would be attributed to, or almost similar to NDVIs. At that point, there was very limited technology to help us amalgamate environmental predictors to help us understand better the areas of habitat. And perhaps moving to the right side of this slide is a better way forward. Adding more environmental layers is key. So the more granular maps that you have, the clearer is the agenda development, and the scope of intervention will therefore match the perhaps appropriate management regime. When we have low resolution map, say 1 by 1 square kilometer spatial grid, you would see lots of those spots, or isolated red spots. And when you look at high granular, maps with high granularity, we actually see connectivity and the niche overlap better than when you have coarse resolution maps. And finally, the last caveat is about the impacts of climate change. I'd like to make this assertion that when we did our analysis, it seems that even at this point, the important sites for conservation are vulnerable on their own, minus or sans climate change. But their vulnerability is magnified because of extreme weather events. This is the impact of Typhoon Rai, which hit the Philippines in December 2022, almost 3 years ago. It has damaged or destroyed 125,000 hectares of forest in Palawan. This has resulted in the massive contraction of the endemic forest species like the hornbill, a massive contraction of its area of habitat. The upshot of that, or the downside of that, is isolating the surviving populations or individuals of this species from the rest of the island. In the long term, we think that the survival of the species hangs in the balance, and therefore perhaps a last or an additional sort of concern that we suggest is perhaps looking at, in the way forward, is perhaps looking at increasing resilience also in the agenda, apart from just protecting and managing, by investing on ecosystem restoration, so that we increase the connectivity and increase the stability of these remaining critical habitats for many species. I think I'll stop there, and happy to discuss in the next round. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aldrin. And thank you also, Eric and Andy, for all your insights for today's discussion. I'm looking at the time, and what I'd like to do is swiftly move over to the panel discussion and raise some of the issues discussed by our speakers. So we'll still be taking questions from the audience, so please leave your questions in the Q&A chat. But first, I'd like to introduce our final guest for today, and that is Dr. Stephen Woodley. So welcome, Stephen. He was the first chief scientist for Parks Canada and has been a pivotal figure in conservation science for several decades. He's a senior advisor at the IUCN, has led efforts to enhance global biodiversity conservation, and has played a very crucial role in developing strategies for protected area management and policy frameworks. Stephen's a key contributor to the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas and has significantly influenced the integration of science into global conservation policies and practices. I think I could go on, but in the interest of time, I'd much rather we hear from you directly. So a warm welcome, Stephen, and thank you for being part of this event today. So to get started, I'd like to ask you the question about your work at the IUCN. So the lead article identifies the conservation imperatives as crucial areas for preventing imminent species extinctions, representing just 1.2% of Earth's land surface. Given the IUCN's extensive experience in protected area assessment and planning, how do the article's findings and the concepts of conservation imperatives relate to existing IUCN frameworks and initiatives? So we have, for example, the KBAs, the key biodiversity areas, or the green list of protected and conserved areas. Yes, so over to you. What are your thoughts?
Okay, first of all, hello, and hello to everybody online. Good day to you all. I hope you're hearing me okay. My computer took this opportunity to crash, so I've converted to an iPad, and I'm assuming everybody's hearing me fine. So thanks to Eric and Andy and Aldrin for a very thoughtful presentation and indeed for the paper. We certainly welcome this paper. It's an essential to protect sites or habitat for endangered and range restricted species. And this is an important contribution. I want to put it first in a broader context. The problem we have is a truly wicked problem. It's multifactorial. And if we look at endangered species and range restricted species, it's essential that we protect them, but it's only part of the solution. If we use a healthcare analogy, that's the emergency room, and it's not a complete healthcare system. I hope that the 4 goals and the 23 targets of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework are closer to a complete healthcare system. We should keep that in mind. We're always working with limited data sets, and we know that even the IUCN Red List of species is far from complete. It's woefully inadequate in plants, for example. If we had complete data, we would get many more sites, some of which would definitely overlap, but that's important to keep in mind. And this analysis didn't didn't cover the ocean for good reasons, but don't have that kind of data on the oceans, but that's 2/3 of the planet. And we have to keep that in mind. I guess the other factor is that if we protect habitat for rare and endangered species, that's great, but that's not the only reason they're going extinct. And it's already been brought up by Eric and others. There's many other reasons. Probably habitat loss is a little over half of the reasons these things are going extinct, but we can't forget invasive species and pollution and climate change, which are also driving the rates of extinction. The IUCN, through its commissions, like the Commission on Protected Areas and Species Survival Commission, is really the global standard setter for information on species and for area-based conservation. The Key Biodiversity Areas Project was developed by the WCPA and the SSC. It has several criteria for areas of importance, and it includes both species and ecosystems. So the paper today is focused on species, on species that are rare and endangered, and range restricted. But if we just look at KBAs, there are many other criteria, including sites of high ecological integrity, sites of conservation abundance that happen in migration, for example. So if we look at just target 3 of those 23 targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework, it's already been stated, but I'll just restate it. We have to focus not on just the number, on 30. We know we need a lot, but we know we need them to work and be highly effective. They've got to be long-term. They've got to be ecologically connected. They've got to be well managed, integrated into surrounding landscapes. And in fact, all of that wording, people have ensured that they get built into the target itself. So there's an enormous lift in the next 6 years. We're trying to get to 30% in the next 6 years now in order to make this happen. Countries are developing their NBSAPs now. In fact, there's 119 of them in draft as of COP16. And we have to help them. I think the scientific community has to help them take this kind of information and make it real on the ground. And that is an enormous challenge. The practitioners who are doing this, by and large, don't read papers, and they need ways and capacity building to take this information and build it into their conservation frameworks, and incorporate a whole bunch of other things we haven't even talked about today, such as involvement of local populations, free, prior, and informed consent, conservation financing, all to make this happen. So it's quite a jigsaw puzzle. That's where IUCN focuses on putting that puzzle together, and we have N number of guidance documents, both general and specific, as well as capacity building and financing programs to help countries do this. So maybe I'll stop there, and in the interest of time, and we can get on with the discussion.
Thank you very much. I would like to invite Eric or Andy if you have any initial reflections on what Stephen just shared.
Sure. Thank you, Stephen, for your comments. I think that all well taken. The first point about KBAs, I think in that slide of the data analysis, we showed how that's one of the critical layers. So it is beyond just rare species, but other aspects of conservation or why they're selected KBAs in the first place. So that is incorporated. You're absolutely right, and we say this throughout the paper, that this is not by any means a substitute for this alone could stand as a National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plan, the NBSAP as it's called, but it's a critical layer. And I think that if we have to start somewhere, I guess is and we have to prioritize. And I think there's an equal concern among the conservation biology community, uttered by people like Stuart Pym and others, that in our goal for 30 by 30 or more than that, that we have to focus on quality as well as the quantity, the area-based target. And so by ensuring that we keep conservation imperatives front and center in these NBSAPs, I think that we have a chance to do that. Now, in terms of implementation, we have been talking, obviously, the work that Andy presented and Aldrin, that's just the start. We're active in a number of other countries where how to operationalize this whole effort. And as Andy said, there's only so much you can do, as you well know, at the global scale. It's really to put the spotlight on this and call global attention. But then it is handed over to the work of top nationally based scientists to lead this effort and to integrate this into the National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plans, and to not operate in a silo, but to integrate this with other dimensions of society, certainly bringing in local communities, FPIC, other considerations to go forward. We don't want to stay in the spotlight, is the best way to say it. We want to put the spotlight on things and then exit that to leave to these places to work. But I do think strategy is critical. And by saying to the world that this is doable, it's affordable, and that by shining that spotlight on 10 countries right up front, we go a long way to addressing the extinction crisis. Many of these countries also contain islands. Well, the island system are a whole different category, but it's something that needs direct attention, but can only be covered. It probably needs its own webinar just to talk about tropical archipelagos and the future of conservation. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Steve.
Great, thank you very much. I will probably go from the last part of what you just said there, Eric, about the feasibility. You know, obviously we're talking about urgency and importance. And I think there's one element that's been brought up from one of the questions here is about the level of feasibility when it comes to protecting different conservation imperative sites. Do we have a sense of that? So you've already seen the level of costs, you know, that's a very important factor. But how about political opportunity and will? You know, could these provide additional important guidance of where to start in turning this great analysis and study into reality? Because looking at the cost is only one dimension. And do you have any?
Absolutely, yes. And so part of our work in Indonesia, in fact, in Sulawesi, where in just 2 ecoregions, we have 80% of the sites in Indonesia and 50% of the land area. We're working with local groups to do just what you said, is an undertaking, an analysis of feasibility of the sites that are there to put first which are the ones that are most feasible. So we have projects going now in India, Indonesia, Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, and Brazil that Carlos Perez just led, of very much focus on the question of feasibility. Like, what can we do right now that could succeed? Because we obviously don't want to start in places where the obstacles are too great to have success right away. We want to show success at the outset. And we have philanthropists who are now waiting for proposals from our teams in the field to figure out what to fund first. So very much in the forefront of our strategic thinking is how, you know, address feasibility as much as possible now that we've identified the sites globally.
Thank you. And I would like to invite Andy. Do you have anything you'd like to share?
I also would like to add to Eric's point. I think feasibility is one of the very important consideration in terms of conservation imperatives. We want to have near-term impact results to address this urgent problem. And it's a very interesting balance because in some way we can think of a lot of the easier protected sites are probably already taken or they're somewhere. And the last remaining ones are probably harder to protect and less feasible because of political reasons or because of resources. So as we find feasible sites, we also want to balance like what is the most impactful that we can wait and what is worth spending resources on to create pathways to protect these sites that are less feasible. And in other points, we also actually in the paper done an analysis and find out that there over 38% of the conservation imperative sites that are actually currently adjacent to currently protected areas. And that actually means that there's already resources, infrastructure, and probably goodwill there to support expanding protected area and expanding protections, and that it's probably adds a lot of point to those being feasible sites that we can focus on first as well.
Great, thank you very much. I have a lot of questions coming in specifically about the data and methodology, and I think that's one thing I'd like to surface. And a quick question that's been coming in from very many individuals who have joined this session today is, how can countries have access to the shapefiles of the conservation imperatives? Do you have any guidance on how to apply it, as in the case of the Philippines? I'd like to leave that open if anyone would like to take that.
Sure, that we don't have one of our co-authors in the presentation today, Dr. Anub Joshi from the University of Minnesota, who was the lead on the GIS analyses for this project and many of the others we've done, like on the Global Deal for Nature, Global Safety Net, ecoregions, et cetera. So the data are available, and I think that people should contact us and go to our website, and we will make that, and Andy can speak more to that too.
Right, yeah.
But yes, the goal is to make this as available as possible for everybody to use, particularly for countries. If there are people listening today, and I know some of our colleagues contacted us who are actively working on the National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plans for their country, this is exactly the place that we want these data to feed into. So please contact us. Andy?
Yeah, just to add that we actually have the link in the paper as well, and hopefully in this article hub, and hopefully we can share after the seminar to the online maps to the data and the shape files as well. Yeah, so they're available.
Great, thank you very much. And another topic that was discussed is the importance of embedding indigenous knowledge, indigenous communities to be stewards of conservation. And that is entirely key when we also talk about other planetary boundaries, especially with climate change. We had a lot of questions coming. I'd like us to probably spend the rest of this panel to talk about this and to also bring in Aldrin. We had a very good question coming in from Gillian Prance about indigenous populations, and the overall question is, how do they fit into this plan, and how can we ensure the rights of local communities while conserving these sites so they're integrated and co-created into these plans? So I'd like to ask maybe Aldrin if you have any thoughts about that. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, thanks. Thanks for that question. You know, in the Philippines, there's almost 1:1 correspondence between ancestral domains and those KBAs. So it's absolutely necessary that any action on conserving, protecting, and rehabilitating key biodiversity areas would have to be worked with and alongside indigenous peoples and you know, local communities, because many of these areas, public lands, usually are the only areas that are, you know, available for people to you know to occupy, because many of the lowland areas are alienable and disposable, and they're you know, bought. So as you know, poverty in the Philippines, as you know, push many people to the uplands. And then, you know, it creates that sort of conflict between use and demand. And therefore, it's absolutely crucial that they are part of the co-development of a conservation agenda. Thanks.
You know, if I could just add one quick point to that is in the follow-up work, working with local groups and institutions in country, in India, which is one of our targets and a very important top 10 country, in northeastern India is interesting in that almost all of the conservation imperatives polygons are located in areas of indigenous communities. And so our particularly in the state of Meghalaya, we have our teams working there closely to identify the most feasible sites where community reserves can be created, because that's the best mechanism to really address this. So it's top on our list of how can we get more conservation imperative sites under protection, and clearly local stewards who are indigenous people would be the obvious solution to that.
Yes, Woodrin, please do.
Can I add a few, remarks on that? I think that the key is also about the key strategy is also about minimizing the vulnerability and the exposure of poor families and forest-dependent communities and indigenous peoples. That is a key. It's not about arming, local forest communities or, teaching them how to manage, but it is about minimizing or decreasing their exposure and dependency to, your cash economy and that sort of thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Woodrin. Stephen, did you want to share something with that?
Only to say that it's really important that we identify the countries, and it's really important to highlight, for instance, there's 10 countries with the majority of these sites. But in doing so, we've got to be careful to say to the rest of the world, the 200 or so countries that are implementing this program, that they don't have a responsibility. They do have a responsibility. If you look at conservation priorities in a place like Canada, where I'm from, their levels of endemism are extremely low, but which is the nature of moving into the northern parts of the planet. But conservation planners are faced with things like protecting a caribou calving area versus a rare plant, right? And the rare plant might come out as a KBA, might be a conservation priority, but from a conservation perspective, it may be more important to protect that caribou calving area. So I think we all got to keep in mind that these conservation prioritization schemes have their strengths and they have their weaknesses, and that we tell the users about all the caveats that surround them.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Looking at the time, we have time for one final question, and I'd like to direct this to you, Stephen. So it's about it's right off the outcomes of COP16, and this is from a question from James Hallett, who I believe was a speaker at a previous IUCN Congress. Question is, how do efforts to identify and secure conservation areas align with the NBSAPs, the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans?
Well, the NBSAPs are meant to be a strategy to implement all 23 targets. So that includes target 3. So this will be the paper that's produced here should be a really important input into the implementation of target 3, which goes into the NBSAP. It's pretty straightforward, really. But there's an enormous amount of work to be done to bring the people along in the countries, and it's great to see that the effort by Resolve is working on the ground, taking this concept and making it happen on the ground. I wasn't aware of that, and I learned that today, and congratulate them on it.
Great, thank you very much. I wonder if there's any other kind of thoughts of all the questions we've asked today. Anyone would like to share anything further before we round up?
Sure. If I could just say, yeah, I'd just like to thank everybody for attending. We're all foot soldiers in this effort to preserve life on Earth, and there are many mechanisms, there's many ways for us to contribute, from working on NBSAPs if you're a government official or delegates, to citizen scientists, to community members, to indigenous communities. All of us have a stake in this, and just we need a comprehensive plan to save life on Earth. we actually have offered that in other papers in a global deal for nature and a global safety net published in Science Advances previously, that is much more inclusive of all of the layers and all of the concerns that Stephen just uttered. The purpose of this really is to put in sharp focus what we need to do in the next 1 to 3 years, 5 at the maximum. And if we do this, this gives us a little bit of breathing room to do everything else as well. But we don't have a second chance on extinction. And so I urge that we put all our efforts on this right away while we keep our eyes on the larger targets as well that Stephen has articulated. So thank you very much to everybody attending. This has been hopefully useful, not just interesting, but useful as well to all the scientists and conservationists out there. Thank you.
I'm very pleased to hear that. Thank you very much. So I'm going to now leave this with a question that have just been pinged from the side, which I think will be a really great way to end this up, and is, what can we do as scientists? What can scientists do to elevate this analysis to philanthropists, to development agencies and other funders? What are the key next steps? So what I'm going to do is I'd like the panelists to leave us with your final takeaway message to the scientific community with this in mind, so that we have a very strong marching order moving forward. So we have a minute each. Well, actually, no, 30 seconds each. So let's start off with Andy. Do you have anything that you'd like to share as closing remarks for everyone?
That's a quick 30-second bit. I was reflecting on my thoughts on writing this paper, being a co-author, and then also leading the country effort and having the opportunity to work with both scientists and local groups. And I think this paper is an amazing opportunity to for me to learn about and how we can use science and help and enable and empower local groups and works to implement protections. And I think really like to see conservation imperatives being taken ownerships by a lot of these implementing organizations and using them as a tool to adopt and actually leverage support for the very important work they're already doing on the ground, and they're able to integrate conservation imperatives into that. And I think that is very important.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andy. Aldrin, over to you. What would you like to share? You're on mute.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Thank you. Despite the devastation in the Philippines and onslaught of typhoons, etc., my message is perhaps for us to avoid the Romeo error. As you know, Romeo, when he saw Juliet lying down almost dead or seemingly dead, took the poison himself. And so, sorry, it's the other way around. But you know, I think there's much hope. If we can put our acts together by improving our conservation science and improve conservation practice, you know, later on, conservation leaders will emerge, and that will be the start of the change. And many often, change happen when you see, you know, people see proof of concept. And this happens when, you know, we improve our conservation science, we show better conservation practice, and we show conservation results, and we make conservation work. That is, I think, what will turn the tide in this battle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aldrin. Stephen.
I've just experienced COP16, and I came away rather buoyed by the fact that the energy, the global energy going towards this conservation problem is astonishing. It's not just the scientific community, it's indigenous groups, it's NGOs, it's the business community, it's the finance community, and it's truly become mainstream. And people are taking this seriously, and I'm really buoyed by the level of energy that's going into it.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to have the final words from you, Eric. Try to top your previous statements, but your article is what led this whole session, has brought us all together. So what would you like to say?
Thank you. I think that approaching this requires both a top-down and a bottom-up or ground level approach. We've just spent a fair bit of time talking about the top-down, and we've heard just the beginnings of the ground level approach from Aldrin and from what we see that we're undertaking at Resolve with other countries as partners and local communities. So I think that the role here for people listening, it's engage in the science, those who are scientists, is like, we need that granularity. We need to improve what we've done within at much higher spatial scales that you can contribute. We need you to take ownership of this. It's your map too. Make it your map. We need advocacy. You can't just sit on the sidelines and having done the science and say, okay, my work is done, I'll hand this off. You've got to be part of that solution. And finally, something that we haven't talked about enough today is the role of the private sector here. There are now major large land footprint companies operating in some of these top countries for conservation imperatives that could literally finance the protection of these sites if they jump in and do their share. And that's another important area for advocacy, is we have to bring these big companies along to help us save life on Earth. It's only going to make their investments more sustainable and make us all sustainable. So thank you.
That's very impactful, and thank you very much, Eric. And thank you to all of you for your insights, and thank you to our audience, or everyone who joined us today. I really hope you enjoyed this session as much as I enjoyed interacting with our experts here. So to end this, I'd just like to say a huge thank you once again from us and our guests, Eric Dinerstein, Andy Lee, Aldrin Mallari, and Stephen Woodley, and for myself, thank you, and we'll hopefully see you once again. So I'd like to ask you all to wave to our audience so you can say goodbye, and we'll catch you at our next deep dive. Thank you.